So, welcome everyone. Welcome to Pint of Science, Pint of Science edition Eindhoven. My name is Roy van der Meel. I'm an assistant professor at the Eindhoven University of Technology, and very honored that as city coordinator of Pint of Science Eindhoven, we're hosting Wijnand IJsselsteijn tonight. And Wijnand is a colleague of mine at the university here in Eindhoven, but our research topics are, I think, quite a bit apart. And that's why I find it myself so interesting. And I'm very happy to have him here with us. So Wijnand is a full professor of cognition and effect in human technology interaction. And he's also a PI of the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technology Research Program. I'm reading this from a website, but I know that Wijnand, for a fact, is an international leader in human technology interaction. And what I find most interesting about it is both has a background in social sciences, so neuropsychology and computer science. And I think what he will share with us tonight is also on both or hits both of those topics. He's also the scientific director of the interdisciplinary Eindhoven University of Technology Center for Humans and Technology. So combining user-centered and value-sensitive approaches to technology, understanding, and design. So the human psyche and technology. That's what we're, that's what Wijnand will talk about tonight. So if you've been joining the other Pint of Science meetings that have been ongoing since last week, you know how this will work. But for those of you who are joining tonight for the first time, Wijnand will start his talk in a bit, and this is broadcasted live on YouTube and on Facebook. So please type your comments and questions in the chat. They will come in to me, and I will be able to relay them to Wijnand. You can ask questions or make comments throughout this talk, and I will forward them. And of course, hopefully there is some time in the end to have a lively interaction with Wijnand. So without much further ado, Wijnand, and the floor is yours. I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and thanks again for making time for us tonight.
Thank you so much, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello to everybody watching this live. Also, hello to everybody who's going to be watching this online later on, maybe via YouTube or other means. I'm beaming live from my study, and behind me is the kitchen where pizza is being made. So there might be some rumble and fumble going on in the background. There we have the beer. I enjoy being here. I hope you will enjoy my talk. Feel free to ask questions, as Roy said, and Roy will post them to me. And I hope I'll be able to respond to your questions. I have a presentation I'd like to share with you, so I'll start doing that right now. I'll share my screen. Okay, here we go. And in view of the current situation with COVID and all the lockdown measures, I've named my presentation "Physically Distant, Socially Close." It's about mediated social touch. So using social touch at a distance through technology. Now this work has started already back in the mid 2000s, so like 2005, 2006. I've been working on this together with Antal Haans, my partner in crime at TUE, and with various other people, and most recently including our PhD student Sima Ipakchanaskari. And together we've been studying, the way in which social touch may affect interpersonal communication when it's mediated. So when it's mediated by technologies. What I'll do in my presentation is I'll highlight some of the functions of social touch and how it's represented in the brain. Then I'll go quickly over some of the ways in which designers have thought about social touch and ways in which to mediate social touch through internet, through technology. And then I'll highlight some studies that we've done over the years, trying to find out whether social touch technology can elicit the same kinds of social responses from people that real unmediated or collocated touch would yield. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that we've all become acutely aware of the importance of touch because many of us have been deprived from it for over a year. You know, I'm in the happy situation of having a family, so I get touched quite a bit, but there are people out there living alone, for instance, that have a hard time, and there are people that, you know, cannot be with their loved ones, with their partner, with their family, that live abroad, for instance. So it's a real need that we're seeing here. And also, I think we're sort of disengaged from each other, right? We're disengaged from going to parties, going to club events, to music festivals, to conferences. So I think many of us have felt the urge to reach out and touch. And as like Sally LePage says on her Twitter feed, you know, has anyone found a half decent substitute for hugs? Really struggling with the lack of physical contact. I think that's true for many people. Not all, but many. So some of us have, you know, found sort of make-do solutions. For instance, using plastic screens to protect us from the virus, but still have the intimacy of touch, the warmth, the closeness, and that works fairly well. However, it doesn't scale so well, if you like. So let me first highlight the importance of touch, and not just in times of COVID, but touch is fundamental to human health and well-being. When a baby is born, it really needs to be touched lovingly and caringly for instance, its immune system to develop properly, but also for its social emotional well-being. And we've seen in many cases where people have not been cared for in the proper way. For instance, there were examples from Romanian orphanages back in the 1980s where children were being fed and being kept clean, but they were not being lovingly touched, and they developed all kinds of developmental disorders, including disorders of social emotional attachment and relationship formation, which really affected their quality of life and their health in negative ways. We also know from animal studies that animals reared under conditions of touch deprivation, so young animals born taken away from their mothers, are likely to yield all kinds of, or generate all kinds of problems in terms of immune system problems, higher likelihood of developing cancers, a high stress life, being underweight, etc. So touch really is a very important part of our well-being. It's also critical if we want to express intimacy and positive affect to each other, right? There's no surprise there. I think all of us recognize if you love somebody, you touch them, be it your children, your partner, your friends. Touch is also important in team building. We know from various studies that teams who are successful tend to touch more. Now, that's a correlation, right? It's not a cause effect. So it could be that once you start winning, you start touching. But there's some evidence that also teams that are closer, physically closer in their training sessions also are more likely to win, because it also points to team coherence and just being able to go that extra mile for each other. In fact, touching is so popular that people are willing to pay good money for it. Recent years, or actually across the last pandemic, the COVID pandemic, there was a ban on touching or on hugging in the Belgian soccer league, but still soccer players can't keep from touching each other. I think it's a 750 euros per touch or per hug fine, and I believe this fine is going to a good cause. So in fact, I hope that this is money well spent, let's say. But you can see that there's a real need even amongst those who are already close together on the pitch. Now, touch also is very important in reducing our sense of stress and anxiety. So if you're stressed, even better than talking to each other is being touched, right? So if you want to help somebody who feels stressed, just give them a neck rub or hold them lovingly, and that will be more likely to help them reduce anxiety. There's some data to support that. There are many studies out there actually that support this. This is one example of a study, and I will just briefly go through the data with you. And don't worry, I won't show too many graphs today. Here's a study was done in the mid 2000s. I think it's based in London. A research group that researched a number of participants, female participants, who were asked to come to the lab to do a stressful task. And by stressful task, this was a standardized stress task known as the Trier social stress test. And basically, it's a test that gives people the task of presenting themselves to, let's say, a reluctant audience. So basically, you have to present your own CV, more or less, like a job application kind of situation, to an audience that's not that friendly and responsive. So you get some time to prepare for that. And then at that event, you also will need to solve some mathematical equations. Now, many people will get stressed by speaking in public, and especially if there's also some math on the line. Now, on this graph that you see here, the point where this test was announced is around about here, where you see stress going up. And stress actually is measured in this case by mean salivary cortisol, which is a stress hormone that can be measured through taking samples from somebody's spit, right, from somebody's saliva. That saliva is being measured every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes here at intervals. And you can see that generally speaking, stress or the cortisol levels are going up for everybody. Now, this gray bar here is the time that people had to prepare, right? So there's about, I think the sample was 67 women across 3 groups, so not completely even groups, but more or less even. And in this time, this 10 minutes, they got to prepare their presentation that they had to give to this audience. Now, there were 3 groups. So these women were put into 3 different groups, right? So 20, 23, 25, whatever. And so one group had no interaction. By no interaction, I mean no interaction with their spouse, because all these women were asked to come to the lab with their male partner. They were married or at least had a relationship for over 12 months, a stable relationship, and their partners were asked to also join them at the lab and help these women prepare for their presentation. Now, if you look at the group that's called no interaction, you can see there is this blocks. You can see stress is going up fairly fast. There was a second group where the male was instructed to talk to their female spouse to try and set their minds at ease. Now, as you can see, that doesn't help. In fact, it does quite reverse. It's actually more stressful during the preparation time, and it doesn't really help ameliorate the stress later on either. The third group, which is the one we're interested in here, is called physical contact group. The physical contact group actually was instructed to give their spouses a neck rub and not actually provide any verbal comments. And you can see here that the stress levels of these women were quite low, and they stayed low, relatively speaking, to the others across that time frame of doing the actual presentation, which is when the stress peaked, as well as afterwards. So this is just one study, one piece of evidence that shows that physical contact, and in this case a neck rub, can help in relieving anxiety.
Hey, Wijnand, can I ask you a question quickly?
Sure.
So about this study, right? I don't know if you know this, but so these were done with where you have your significant other with you. Do you know if there's studies been done if there would be a difference if the, let's say, if it wasn't the partner providing physical contact, but for example, a friend or a female friend, or
that's a very
would you
good
expect
question.
the same?
I'm not aware of the data, but I can predict the result. I think that for people in a supporting relationship, I think you will find similar results. Now, this might differ a little for male-male supporting relationships, because we know that there is some touch aversion between men, homophobia we call that. So there might be a little bit of a stress effect. If you have an unknown other, that might actually add to the stress. So getting a neck rubbed by somebody you don't know actually will probably add to the stress rather than relieve it.
I can imagine.
Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So we've had, intimate relationships, supporting, we had team building, we've had stress reduction. Another function of social touch is persuasion. And this is an interesting one, kind of a double-edged sword, but if you touch somebody in a socially appropriate way, let's say on the shoulder, that person will be more likely to like you, to be persuaded by you, and to do things for you. If you have a request to them, they'll be more likely to comply with that request. Now, this is known as the Midas touch, and I would like you to keep that in your memory, store that for a while, because that'll be a paradigm we'll come back to when we talk about some of our experiments. Now, quickly, let us look to the brain and what touch does in terms of brain representation. And we see there are two main areas involved here when touching. This is the brain. Actually, we're looking at the brain here from the left side. So here's the frontal lobe of the brain, where all the the planning and the self-control happens. Here's the back of the brain, the visual cortex, where we process visual information, and this little green strip here, more or less down the center of the brain, which also actually goes to the right-hand side of the brain, is known as the somatosensory cortex, and this is where touch is being processed. And particularly, it's being processed for things like location, force, so all the tactile qualities that you would have if you touch, for instance, a bottle of beer, which I haven't touched yet up until this moment. So this somatosensory cortex is involved in detecting the environment, identifying objects, identifying textures, etc. It will be sensitive to warmth and other kinds of senses, pain, stimuli. And we know this by very meticulous work where, different areas of the brain have been stimulated, and you could see, for instance, in a brain scan, different areas of the somatosensory cortex light up. Similarly, or conversely, I should say, there's also been brain stimulation work, especially by Walter Penfield back in the 1950s, where he would give electrical stimulation to the somatosensory cortex, and people would report being touched in different areas of their body. And based on that kind of work, there was a map made called the sensory homunculus, which maps out more or less where things are in the somatosensory cortex, how our body is being represented in the somatosensory cortex. And this is mapped on the left-hand side here. And you can see this is kind of a weird human figure, right? It's slightly misconstrued, but there are also some size differences. And these size differences are actually representations, graphical representations of, let's say, the cortical real estate that different areas of our body get. So really sensitive areas like the face area have a lot of nerve endings associated with them, and consequently will also have a lot of neural representation dedicated to processing the information coming from those areas. So, for instance, our face is typically very sensitive, especially the lips. Our hands are also very sensitive. We're prehensive creatures, right? We touch things, we feel things, and we navigate the world also very much through the use of our hands. We can also see that some of our less sensitive areas, for instance, the back of the neck, the back of the our backs, basically, the back of the head. Not really sensitive. The legs are also somewhat less sensitive, but then we come to the feet, and we see that they're really sensitive. And actually, in terms of neural representation, they're located quite closely to the genitals, which might be somewhat of an explanation of why a feet rub can have erotic connotations. It actually maybe through spreading of activation of the different brain areas excite not just the feet or the toe area, but also the genital area. So that's just a tidbit of knowledge, nothing to do with technology, but I thought, I'd share it with you tonight. So I mentioned two main areas that are associated with touch. Somatosensory cortex being one of them. The other one is the insula. Now, for the insula, we need to look deeper inside the brain. And the brain is like almost a stacked system where you have the really basic stuff like breathing and heart rate and all those things. They're in the very basic areas of the brain. Then you have on top of that, you have more or less the emotional areas that help us respond to pertinent stimuli like dangers in the environment or food in the environment or potential mates in the environment. And then there's this whole thinking mechanism and perception mechanism on top of that known as the neocortex. So this insula is actually located very closely to this limbic system, which is known to be associated with emotions. And the insula actually fires up when we are being touched in socially significant ways. So there's some experimentation done. For instance, when you're touched in a very slow way, that could be a social touch, like a nice, gentle rubbing of your arm, the insula would light up. But if you're touched in a way that's sort of not social at all, very fast, for instance, or painful, that doesn't light up. That doesn't activate the insula as much. So the insula seems to register socially meaningful interactions through touch. There's some brain data, scanning data that supports this. Insula, for instance, or this whole pathway actually from nerve endings up until to the brain mechanism respond to touches with particular speed, also with a particular softness. So if you do it painfully, it won't respond the same, and also with a particular temperature. And that temperature is quite critical to skin temperature. It responds actually to temperatures around 32 degrees, which is more or less the temperature of our outer skin. So if you're being touched by another person's skin, you're being touched by a temperature that's just right for the insula to respond to. So you feel that there's already a social significance in this representation. Okay, so now we understand a little bit about the importance of touch and about how the brain deals with touch and how there are two different systems, basically, one representing more or less the world out there and one representing social significance of touch. If we talk about interpersonal communication, we know that we have already hearing and seeing as my slide just went a little crazy on me, so let me go back to it. I'm not sure if you're seeing this, but so here we have hearing and seeing in communication at a distance. So one can call each other, we can hear each other's voices, and nowadays, oh, don't we know it, we're on Teams, we're on Zoom, we're on Skype, we see each other as well. But there's no technological equivalent for touching each other at a distance. And given the fact that I've just mentioned how important and basic touch is for, well-being, for communication, for intimacy, for persuasion even, it's kind of puzzling that there's not already just sort of a solution that you could go to the Bijenkorf or to some other, to the Media Markt and buy something that would give you this touch. Well, yes and no. There are some partial solutions already available, and I'll just walk you through it. However, it's not like this. It's not like we can sort of do a fist bump during a telco. However much the people of Cisco want to make us believe that their systems will allow us to do that, that's not yet the case. It's important to differentiate between general haptic feedback and mediated social touch. In fact, general haptic feedback has been around for a while. since the early days of virtual reality, which allows us to give us, a sense of touch whenever we touch an object, right? And some of that's being simulated, for instance, by exoskeletons, by force feedback devices, usually quite clunky, expensive robotic devices that will allow us to, for instance, grab an object or touch a surface. When we're talking about mediated social touch, we might be using the same technologies, but we don't necessarily need to, right? We're talking about touch that will be socially meaningful and socially significant. And typically what we see is that we can get away with much lower fidelity stimulation or technology to generate a sense of social touch. So here's a couple of examples. They're not very recent, but you typically see on the left side, you see electromechanical vibrators or actuators, if you like, quite akin to the ones that you have in your mobile phone. If you put it on silent and it vibrates, that's the kind of thing that starts vibrating. And you can put them in arrays, and you can innervate them or actuate them at different speeds and different intensities to give you a sense of a pattern, for instance, of touching. On the lower left side, you see a kind of a Gaia unit, right? So where you have little pins that can innervate your fingertips. On the top right, you see electrical devices that might, through electrical pulses, generate nervous impulses. And on the lower right-hand side, you see a heating element that could heat up. There are other solutions as well. For instance, things that put pressure on you, or things that would be more mechanical in nature. So what I'll briefly go through is some of the designs that have been worked on in various labs across the years. I mean, this started more or less in the mid-90s. There are even some examples from the 80s. But more or less, people started seriously looking at the design of touch from the mid-90s onwards till today. And actually, we're now seeing an upsurge in interest in these mediated touch devices because also of this situation that we currently find ourselves in, this pandemic that makes us stay at home and socially distance. So here's a prototypical design, quite an early one. It's called Hug Over Distance. The author is Floyd Mueller. You can see him here in the picture on the bottom left. What he designed was an interface where there is a pressure sensor in a koala bear. He's working from Australia. Maybe that explains the koala bear. You give the koala bear a hug, and then that signal is being sensed and then transmitted to an inflatable vest. This is the sort of innards of the inflatable vest. It would be a vest like the kind I'm wearing right now, and that would suddenly inflate if that koala bear gets pushed at a distance, and you would feel like you're getting some pressure, right, like a hug. Only thing is that this needs a compressor to blow in the at speed and at pressure air into the inflatable vest, which made quite a noise and wasn't as discreet as you might want it to be if you're receiving a hug at a distance. Another sort of mid-2000 prototype was the Toptop prototype. It's based on these electromechanical actuators inserted into a cloth. A piece of a scarf in this sense that you could wrap around your body at different places, and people could innervate that from a distance, giving a sense of touch. Now, bear in mind these are the kinds of things that we've been using in our experiments as well. So you will see some prototypes, not as neatly designed as this scarf, but some prototypes of, let's say, tactile vests, which include these kinds of electromechanical actuators as well. Here's one from Adrian Chiuk of 2012. He had a ring known as the RingU, the hugging communication ring, where you could press the ring and the other person would feel a little vibration, and the other person could press back. All of this would go through a mobile app and be conveyed over the internet. Somewhat more recent designs, Kissinger, also actually from Adrian Chiuk's group, PhD students from his group, designed this, where you can have a kissing sensation. I'm not sure how convincing it is, but the idea is that you press with the button with your lips, and that gets conveyed to the other person, and those this flexible rubber surface will move as if you're being kissed as well. They claim that it's an effective communication of deep emotions and intimacy through a multisensory internet communication experience. Quite a claim, I should say. This other device here is the Kiss transmitter. And you can see a little straw here, which you're supposed to put in your mouth and wiggle it around with your tongue, and you can have a virtual kiss with another person. I think it's fair to say that you can already see that from these prototypes, many of the touches, if you like, especially the intimate ones in this case, are quite rudimentary, are quite sort of, okay, they feel a little bit techy rather than, having all the sensory qualities that we would expect in a touch. There are some commercial devices readily available for you to buy. One is the Hey Bracelet, where you can wear a bracelet. You can send a signal to the other person, and the bracelet will squeeze, and you can send a signal back, and you will send a gentle squeeze in return. A prototype that's been around for a while, let's say, it started, I think, back in 2002, 2003, the Huck Shirt, has made a resurgence recently, and you can order your own Huck Shirt if you like, which sends hugs at a distance. Basically, this Huck Shirt is a two-way street, so you can hug yourself more or less, or give your shirt a hug, and that will be also conveyed to the other person's shirt, where elements of the shirt would constrict, for instance, and give a sense of being hugged, and you could hug back using the same technology. So it's a sensor actuator kind of system, in a nice design of a shirt. These are commercial products that you can buy or order online. Now the question is, does this work? We've seen this claim of it being a huge and intimate experience, but there's little empirical study available, few empirical studies available, that really look at sort of whether or not this conveys touch in socially meaningful ways. So this is one of the things we set out to do. In our lab at the TU Eindhoven, we're looking at whether or not these kinds of mediated social touches are similar in their effects to real unmediated social touches. And one of the paradigms we took was the paradigm of, let's say, response similarity. So if we can get the same responses to mediated social touches as you would get to unmediated social touches, that will be an argument for it to be perceived or at least processed in meaningful ways, in socially meaningful ways. So that's what we set out to do. So one of the steps that we took was to design a tactile vest. Here you see a student of ours, an ex-student of ours. He's probably much older now. I'm not sure if he's looking at today, but this is a picture of him as a student, and his mom actually helped design this vest. She was a professional seamstress, and you can see that there's some Velcro attached in the inside of this redesigned surf suit, basically, where we've put an array of electromechanical actuators, and we could place them basically through this Velcro system at any point in this suit. And it was really a flexible solution that could also be fitted to the size of a person, because people, of course, differ in size, and you would want the pressure of those tactile actuators or haptic actuators to be similar for different sized people. All right, so Christian did our first experiment, actually, looking at whether or not there's a difference in the experience of being touched remotely or virtually if you think the person touching you is either male or female. So this was known as the gender effect study. Now we know from literature that females don't mind to be touched by another female so much, but males don't like to be touched by another male, at least not a stranger. there's, that has something to do with dominance relationships, etc. There's a bit of a homophobia going on in male touching. It's not as accepted. Males don't like it as much as females like being touched by other females, and cross-sex touching is less problematic. So we had an experimental design, and I won't bore you with all the details, but basically we had different body locations that people were being touched on, and importantly, we told them they were either touched by Julia or by William. Now, there was no Julia, there was no William, there was only us pressing the buttons, but people were getting sitting behind a desk, getting a task of evaluating an interface, and they were being touched on the belly or touched on the shoulder, and they had to evaluate basically what they thought of these touches. And long story short, our experiment didn't completely work, but in the qualitative comments, we really found some really nice confirmation, let's say, of the suspicion that we had that men do not like being touched by men, even if it's virtual, right? So, for instance, men typically would say, I don't like William touching my belly. Whereas, of course, there was no actual touching because it was electromechanical motors, actuators, and there even wasn't an actual William, right? So it was basically in the experiment that we made him believe that he was being touched by another male, which already led to this sort of homophobic reaction. Sorry about that. So
Wijnand, can I maybe ask you a question while we're on the subject, because this is very interesting, right? On one side you have the importance of touch, and being deprived from touching is has negative effects. But then you also have the importance of who is touching you. Which of the two or both maybe do you think is more important? I guess maybe depending on the situation is the fact that who is touching you or the fact that you are being touched of more importance?
That's a very good question. I think you're touching upon one, no pun intended, about one of the areas that we're currently investigating, which is the importance of context for touch, right? So Seema, the PhD student that's working on this area, is really looking into what is the importance of framing a person as somebody you know or somebody you don't know, right? So this was one of the first experiments that we did in this area where, does context matter? And yes, it does, right? So if you think about getting a touch, a very nice physical sensation, let's say a warm touch on your shoulder, for instance, and it's either from your wife or girlfriend or it's from your boss. Those are two quite different experiences, even though the physical sensation can be identical. Right. Yeah. Now, the physical sensation in and of itself might be pleasant, but the meaning that you construe based on that will be radically different. So it's actually the touch technology allows us to disentangle context from the actual physical sensation, but in people's minds, they're always they're always entangling them again.
Sure.
So even though we can technologically disentangle them and study them even in separation, people integrate the experience and want to know what is the intention with which I'm being touched, who is touching me, why are they touching me, and that also is actually a sign that if context matters so much, in fact we're onto a technology that is socially meaningful, that has an impact. Because if it wouldn't matter, right, in the way you're being touched because you're thinking, oh, this is just technology, nobody's really touching me, then it shouldn't matter who's touching you or why they're touching you, right?
True.
But since these social regularities weigh into this equation, then all of a sudden we start realizing, oh, wait a minute, we're actually replicating some of the patterns that we see in our behavior from unmediated situations. So and going back to that question of response similarities, I think this shows you that to an extent at least we're able to replicate these the social meaning construction of touch, even though we have something that is a pretty poor approximation of what a real touch feels like.
Speaking of maybe the poor similarities, there is a question from Taichi, who he would be very curious to know if they the technology with the lips.
Yeah.
He would be curious if they customize the lips for partners, because he would be willing to get one, I think.
Excellent. I'm sure if he has enough money, that could be arranged. I'm sure there's going to be, I see a big future for 3D printing and sort of personalizing stuff in this area. Yeah. So, and I don't think that's too far off technologically speaking. You just have to find sort of a company willing to take this on as a product.
Thanks.
All right. So, thank you for that question. It really helped also for me to explain again that importance of this, response similarity versus the physical reality of, let's say, a poor approximation of the touch sensation itself. Now, moving on to this Midas touch, remember the picture I showed of Bill Clinton touching somebody, and Bill Clinton, of course, was a very convincing communicator, and part of what he did was actually through a lot of touching of people. And so this is known in social psychology as the Midas touch effect. And this is reminiscent of or it refers to the Greek myth of King Midas, who changed as actually a punishment of the gods. He changed everything he touched into gold. This included his food and his daughter, which was obviously a mixed blessing. However, in social psychology, the Midas touch is seen as a purely pro-social effect, right? So it's something that if you touch somebody, they will be more positively inclined towards you. They will be more likely to comply to your requests. They will be more likely to give you help if you need help. They will be more likely to like you. And so there's been many experiments actually showing this in face-to-face settings, so in unmediated settings. For instance, if you want to get on a bus and you don't have a bus ticket, if you touch briefly the chauffeur on the shoulder in a very friendly way, you'll be more likely to be let on the bus for free. If you're walking your excitable dog and you want to go into a store where you can't bring your dog, and you ask somebody, would you want to hold my dog for like 5 minutes while I go shopping? If you pair that request with a brief tap on the shoulder, you're more likely to have that person wait for you with your dog whilst you do your shopping. If you work in a restaurant, and let's hope, some of you will be able to do that in the near future. So if you work in a restaurant and you give people the bill, if you do that whilst giving them a brief tap on the shoulder, socially accepted, and you give them the bill, you're more likely to get a higher tip. And finally, also, if you are clumsy and you drop your stuff in front of somebody, if you before that dropping of your stuff had touched that person, for instance, by asking directions. I mean, this is the lengths that social psychologists will go through, right? In contriving situations that will get people to help them. So here's, you're going to a bus stop, you're asking somebody, oh, do you know the directions to the train station? And you're briefly touching them and then clumsily dropping your stuff, right? So the chances that they will help you in picking up that stuff is much higher when you briefly touch them than when you just ask for information without touching them. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that social psychologists have done over the years to show that touch has pro-social effects, and it will actually be beneficial to you and make people help you and like you more. Now, this latter example that I gave of this, you drop something, is known as the dropping of items paradigm. And I'm highlighting that because this is actually the paradigm that we also used in our lab, but then to investigate the mediated touch case, right? So the touching through technology. And we were wondering, does this Midas touch effect occur if you are being touched via an electronic device, via an electromechanical actuator? Remember, we're putting somebody, we're putting a sleeve on somebody with some electromechanical actuators, so it does buzz, buzz. And is that socially significant enough for people to want to help each other more. All right, so here's a brief description again of the experiment. We had all male sample of participants, so 60 participants, and we had a female confederate. So the participants basically thought, all these males that we brought into the lab basically thought there were 2 participants, right? It was them plus a female participant. Now, the female participant actually was in on it. She was a confederate of ours, instructed to do things in a certain sequence of ways. The male participant actually received a neoprene arm strap with 4 actuators that provided this electromechanical vibration. Now, the setting was that they were put into different locations, physically remote from each other. They couldn't see each other. They couldn't hear each other. They certainly couldn't touch each other. And they were asked to communicate through a chat application. And basically, the participant was always put in the role of the interviewer. He had to ask our confederate, how was your day? How did you spend your weekend? What did you do? Was it fun, etc.? And our confederate always answered in the same way. Now, of course, they didn't know this, right? They thought the confederate was freely answering, but all of this was pre-scripted, pre-structured. So we gave the participant, the real participant, the male, a list of questions that he should be asking, which he did through the chat interface. And at some of the answers that the female was given, she would either give a small buzz, she would accompany her text answer with a small buzz, or she wouldn't, right? So there's either a touch or no touch. That's the only difference between the conditions. All right, so now the dropping of items paradigm. As you know, psychologists pretend the experiment is about one thing, but then it actually is about something else. So in this case, we said it was about evaluating the interface, right? Evaluating the interaction. And then we had them both in the same room, filling out some questionnaire. And then our confederate, the female confederate, dropped her pen case, right? So lots of pens on the ground, writing utensils. And then our measurement started. Basically, is the participant, the male participant, going to be helping her or not? And our expectation was that if the male participant had been touched in the remote conversation that they just had, he would be more likely to help her. Had he not been touched, he would be less likely to help her. Well, results, indeed. So in the condition where people had been touched, they helped 3 out of 4 times. In the condition where they hadn't been touched, they helped 1 out of 2 times, right? So basically, in half the cases, they would just sit there and watch it. And after being touched, they would do that to a lesser extent, right? They would only do that in 25% of the cases, more or less. This was a significant difference and a really nice difference. And in terms of effect size, also similar to the effect sizes that have been found in face-to-face or unmediated situations. However, there was one thing that bugged us in this experiment, because our confederate was sending the signal of touching or no touching, and she knew basically whether she was touching somebody or not. So we felt like, okay, well, maybe that knowledge in itself would lead to subtle different cues. Maybe she would wait a little longer before starting to picking up the pencils herself, or maybe she would be more friendly to the person she touched versus the person she didn't touch. So there might be some nonverbal leakage going on there that we have no control over as experimenters. So we thought, the fact that this is technology mediated gives us the power to also have a blind confederate. We could create a situation where we would say to our confederate, either all the touches are being conveyed or all the touches are not being conveyed, or you just don't know, right? But we didn't have to put her in control of the actual touching, because we could just flip a switch and have the person being touched or not, right? So based on that, we did the experiment again, right? We ran it again, seeing if a blind confederate would actually yield the same results. And lo and behold, the results were in the same direction. But as you can see, the effect was slightly smaller and actually lacked significance in this case. Which begs the question, what has been happening all this time in the other experiments, right? So in the experiments where people have been touched and then were asked to help, or had been touched, and then asked for the free ride on the bus, or getting a other kinds of experimental situations where it's hard to disentangle, let's say, the knowledge of having touched the person and then having another interaction. And so our experiment actually allowed to disentangle the social situation that was subsequent to the touch from knowledge of having touched somebody. And we see that the experiment still is in the right direction. The results are still in the expected direction, but they're smaller. Now, if you look at the total number of experiments, you do a meta-analysis, you can see that on the top here, you have the results that people have found in the field, unmediated touching, and here are our results. And actually, we see that effect size is, pretty fucking similar. So, I just said something I shouldn't have been saying. Okay, I'm sorry. Pretty similar. So they're really, the risk ratios are stunningly similar. So I think that bodes well for the idea that there is some kind of response similarity going on, but it also teaches us a lesson, which is that we actually shouldn't assume that an experimenter that knows about the manipulation has no impact on the eventual results, right? So these results might actually be a little bit too positive, given the fact that all these people in this experiment knew that there was touch going on, that there was social touch happening. All right. So as a final experiment, and I'll in the view of time, I will breeze through this a little bit faster. We were also interested in, okay, so touch is now being conveyed through, let's say, innervating a button of some kind and a person being touched. We wondered, does it matter if you have an input device that has a human shape, that has some kind of correspondence to the person that's being touched, and that is an intuitive mapping between the touch input and the touch sensation, right? So we had an experiment where we looked at doing a touch either on a mannequin's back, basically, and we had sensors in this embedded in the mannequin's shirt that would innervate or actuate the touch array on a person's back, right? So we had a participant wearing the haptic vest, the tactile vest again, and this person is our accomplice, and he is touching the back of our mannequin as an input to the shirt that's being worn by our participant. Now that was one condition. The other condition was the same experimenter, but now pressing a button to do the same signal, send the same signal. Okay, so what's our expectation here? We would expect basically that if you have morphologically congruent inputs, so through the mannequin, you would expect a higher sense of self-attribution, basically, so a higher sense of the idea that your body is actually over there, it's the mannequin's body. And there will be also a sense of that these touches will be perceived as more natural, and we would expect actually a higher arousal following a mediated touch that was in offered in a morphologically congruent way versus a morphologically incongruent way. So again, we had a number of participants. In this case, we had male-male contact, one male confederate, 20 male participants. Used 8 touches to various body parts. And we used self-report for telepresence and naturalness of touch. And we used skin conductance, of course, to measure the arousal. Now, our results, very briefly, we did find a very strong effect of the skin conductance response. So the mannequin actually yielded a larger effect than being touched by the touchscreen. Somewhat less pronounced, but still significant effects on telepresence and naturalness, where also the mannequin would yield larger sense of telepresence, larger sense of naturalness. Okay, so all of this combined gives us a number of insights, and I would like to close with those some final thoughts. So one, I think, and that sort of rewinds to the start of the presentation, that a need for touch is really fundamental to us being human. It's fundamental to the human condition. And there's really no simple way to replace social touch via technology, even though with relatively minimalist technologies, we were able to get already some socially meaningful experiences going. However, we do believe that this touch experience depends very much on the context. Who's doing the touching? Is it a male or a female? Is it a friend or a vague acquaintance? Is it your boss or your wife? I mean, all those are important. And with what intention are you being touched, right? Is it a tap on the shoulder to call your attention? Is it a firm touch to support you? Is it a confronting touch? And are we in the mood for it? I mean, is it part of the situation? Are we in a situation where we can accept the touch and be supported by it? I think it's also fair to say that touch is still rather underrepresented in research, especially social touch. And there's an incredible design space to be explored here. And I think the skin is rather underexploited for the design of communication. From our experiments, I think it's fair to say that we have some tentative evidence that mediated social touch yields effects that are comparable to unmediated touch. Sorry. But in order to go a step further, we really need better prototypes. And we really also need more representative social communication settings. For one, not all the results are significant, as we've seen. And some of these studies that have been done in the field yield quite mixed results. So, but admittedly, some of the situations that are being simulated are also quite artificial. So it feels like we should probably be moving towards both more realistic situations, but also more realistic and maybe stronger types of touch interactions. And finally, and this pertains to the ability to disentangle, let's say, the physical experience of touch from the social context of touch, is to say that this mediated social touch technology really offers a valuable research tool for interpersonal touch research. For instance, what we did with getting a blind confederate, right? So somebody that doesn't know, the experimenter that's naive, let's say, to the hypothesis at hand. This is standard practice in medical research, where you have double-blind research. It's really hard to do in some of the social sciences, but this is one way of going about doing that. So I think it also offers a valuable research tool. Now, a quick look to the future. Where might things be heading? This is not the future. This is actually today. There is already quite an elaborate touch suit out there. If you have 13,000 euros to spare, you can have quite an immersive touch experience. This is at the moment mainly used for gaming and for force feedback of punches or bullets or what have you. But you could easily imagine how this could also be used for conveying touching, social touching, especially if you keep in mind that the VR space is now being populated also by the largest social media player out there, Facebook, who's acquired Oculus and who's now really looking towards sort of next level social media being immersive web. So our social interactions online will be with avatars of each other and will be involving, highly realistic renditions and interactions within a virtual immersive space. And I feel that touch may be part of that vision. Secondly, I think next to the immersive pathway, there might also be the pathway of, let's say, more integration in everyday objects, jewelry, clothing, furniture, and having subtle touch interactions, but still socially meaningful. Those are more in line with the kinds of research that we've been doing, where a single vibration, a little bit of warmth might already convey a social significant information, provided it's contextualized appropriately there's a context of other communication from media, for instance, or it's clear, clearly set within a relationship where there's an understanding of what these things mean, right? So sometimes it also requires developing a common touch language, like what when your necklace warms up or when your necklace starts vibrating, what that means if you get that signal at a certain point in time from your partner. So those are two sort of main pathways I see: the more immersive, realistic kind of touching, which will be more expensive, and the let's say well-designed, socially significant but minimalist kind of touching that will be part of everyday objects and jewelry and accessories. So I would like to acknowledge the collaboration that we're having as a team to do this work. Without these two people, this work wouldn't exist. Antal Hans and Sima Ipaksham Askari. And with that, I would like to close my presentation and open up for more questions from you.
Thanks, Wijnand. That was very, very interesting. Like I said, our fields of research differ greatly, but I'm also the father of twins since a couple of months, and the importance of touch has definitely not eluded me in the last couple of months. And there's actually I have a few questions about your work, and I didn't want to interrupt you too much already, more than I did. But there's also some questions from people that have been joining us via the live streams on Facebook and YouTube. Cool. So I think you can see them as well. But yeah, there's a question from Christian. So are MST touches perceived differently when the persons can see each other, for example, by video, compared to non-visual?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think I would expect so. In a sense, are the experiments that we did on the visual feedback, the last experiment that I showed hints in that direction, right? So if you have more visual feedback, especially of the kind at the input side, you get also a sense of how you're being touched, right? So if you have, for instance, an input device that looks like a body, and you're stroking that body lovingly, and you get that video feed as well as the sensation of touch, I think that matters, right? So also, of course, the video is relevant for knowing who's touching you, right? And being able to sort of see from other social cues what the intentions are, what the contexts are. So video and other communication media will be really important also to contextualize the meaning of touch. We've done some experiments on, let's say, just the mere sensation of these electromechanical actuators on somebody's skin, but they're not construed in a social way at all if you don't give context of that, you're being touched by another person, right? So in a sense, social touch only becomes social by constructing it as a social situation, right? By knowing who is touching you, with what intention they're touching you, etc. So surely video would help in construing that context.
Great. There's another question that's popping up on the screen now, and Lau7 is asking, can we manipulate our brain to feel less stress if I touch my own shoulder, head, or arm, or is it truly a social thing?
A little bit of both. So for one, we know that self-touching and self-stroking can help. So even holding yourself can help in relieving some anxiety. But also we know that being stroked or held by some other person in a loving way actually has more social significance and also more impact physiologically. In effect, it's also, there's some discounting going on if you're touching yourself, because we also have predictive mechanisms in our brain that predict the signal before it occurs, and that sort of gets subtracted from the actual experience. So this is also one of the reasons why you can't tickle yourself, right? You have to be tickled by somebody else, otherwise it doesn't feel like tickling, because your brain already is predicting the signal and then subtracting it from the actual experience. So I think there is some ways to go, but maybe you could, through mediated touch, you could probably concoct a device that would help you touch yourself in ways that would be unpredictable. And then there might be a better, a larger effect. I would venture to guess.
I see that Taichi has another question that is maybe not so much about kissing technology. He's like, you touched a bit of it in the end, but quite an interesting question is, how would touching technology change the way we interact in social situations? Like he's mentioning silent discos with touch sensors to sort of party life.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So again, I think it depends. If you have a connection, for instance, with, so suppose you go to a silent disco with somebody else, right? And you know that person is in the zone, and you're in the zone, and you're enjoying yourself, and you can sort of express that through touching each other. I think that will be a meaningful way of sharing your experience, right? So you're just letting each other know that you're connected in the experience, even though you're in your own little island of, listening to whatever you're listening to, but you're still connecting at a social or an emotional level. And I think that is meaningful, and that will help in getting a more socially immersive experience. If it's just random signals and being entering your body, it might just be like something you're bumping into somebody, you know they're there, but you're not sure if it's socially significant or not. So I think it depends on the meaning that you can construe based on those touches, right? If you know who's touching you, why they're touching you, if it's significant, if somebody means to say, I care about you, I want to share this with you, then indeed it will help you in intensifying the experience.
I had a question myself, maybe related a little bit to some of so to your experience and experiments, and I was wondering what is your opinion if you mentioned some of the examples where, for example, getting on the bus, maybe briefly touching upon the shoulder of the bus driver, and maybe they let you on for free, but you mentioned some other examples. Do you think that between generations of people, the perception of that touch, maybe what was perceived as something that's fine or socially accepted or maybe even caring by, let's say, the generation, my parents, my grandparents, and now, for example, younger generations, is perceived differently, and if you have a group of 60 people, test persons in your experiment, can something like that influence it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there are cultural norms around touch, right? So I think we have a sense of what's appropriate and what's not, and these differ across cultures. Even at the same time, they differ across cultures. So there's big intercultural differences, for instance, between the touching behaviors of people in the Nordic countries versus people in the southern parts of Europe or in Africa. And so the kinds of implicit, levels of comfort that we feel by being touched in certain ways will differ already between cultures. Then there's also large interpersonal differences, right? Some people are more touch averse, some people are more needy of touch. And you can see there's a change over time. So for one example, in American schools, there have been for a while now no touch policies, which has been instigated from a need to avoid litigation, right? So they don't want any touch to be construed as an inappropriate touch, as sexual intimidation. So they avoid touching at all. Now, I think avoiding touching at all is very unnatural, but it's hard to find that touch is also a negotiation, right? You're really entering another person's personal space. It's a boundary transition. So it really has to be okay for the other person also to receive that. But to avoid it altogether out of fear of litigation, I think is a loss. But that's my opinion, right? So I can imagine that in 20 years' time, people will say, oh, imagine touching another person. I mean, even this COVID situation could actually contribute, because now touching also is becoming implicitly associated to illness, right? It becomes explicitly associated to risk, right? If I touch another person, I now feel a sense of, oh, bacteria, right? Does that person have COVID? I need to wash my hands, that kind of thing. So we start also becoming a little bit obsessive about not touching each other for the fear of health risks. And that might also seep into the norms that we keep within a culture and the kinds of interactions that we allow each other to have. Another part of this is of course from the very justified complaints of the Me Too movement, right? Where there's been a lot of inappropriate touching going on and power dynamics that have led to people having to suffer through touches that they didn't want. So that's also changing our social conception of what's acceptable and what's not. So as men, we now have to be much more self-aware of what we're conveying when we're touching a female or when we're touching a subordinate in let's say in a hierarchy. All of that is part of this chemistry, of this dynamics of social touch, and I think so. It's certainly not a stable thing. It's not the same for everybody. It's not the same over time. It's not the same within or between cultures. And in effect, mediated touch technology may play a role in this at some point, right? If this gets accepted in a wholesale manner, it might lead to more social distancing, but it might also lead to empowerment in a sense, right? Because if I don't want to be touched, I can turn it off. Right? Exactly. I can be either touch needy and say, oh, go on, give it to me. Or I could say, I don't want it. I'm not in the mood for touching, so I'm gonna switch it off. It gives me more autonomy and control. So it's a really interesting discussion. And this is also, I think, what human technology interaction is all about, is trying to understand this complex relationship between human behavior and the affordances and the transformations that we're getting to see in social relationships and in sort of ways in which we interact with the world, through the transformative power of technology.
I think we're closing up pretty soon, so you can go and have your pizza. But I was curious about one more thing, if I can ask you, and that's if you have ever also done experiments comparing for let's say visually impaired people to people with normal sight. And I was wondering if these touch technologies, if people who are visually impaired, if they can pick it up better, that is not a real human touch, and therefore respond worse to it, or that for them it's actually, these technologies should really be developed more, because for them it would be a means, even more so than to people who have normal sight, or is that something that's completely different field of research?
It's a very good question, very interesting. My first gut instinct is let's ask them. Let's ask the visually impaired people to tell us about their experiences. Yep. My gut instinct, but this is an uneducated guess, would be that for them, touch is also a way of seeing. So the way we sample our environment through vision, they have to do that partly, at least, through touch, right? So if they want to see what your face is like, they have to touch your face, which could be an incredibly intimate experience for the one being touched, but it's also just a part of looking what you're like. Not necessarily wanting to touch you in any kind of intimate way, because they still maybe have to establish that relationship. But I feel that the experience of being blind and then using touch to navigate the world also create quite different social affordances. And ones that we may not fully understand as sighted people, with different kinds of affordances of interacting with the world. I could imagine that they would be incredibly sensitive to touch stimulation. Also, mechanical touch stimulation might open up some avenues of exploration, because touch, and this may be good also to know that there have been some tactile visual substitution systems back in the 1960s, even, where people with blindness were basically wearing a camera on a set of glasses and had a piece of tactile feedback technology on their tongue or on their back, and it would project a tactile array, basically pixels, if you like, that would give them information about the outside world. Because vision, of course, is a remote sensing device, whereas for tactile sensing, you need to be close. Now, if you can make tactile sensing also a remote sensing device, you get more of the visual affordances that normal vision has. And I think this is work by Bachirita. And I think their experiments showed that people did get a rudimentary sense of space and of sort of distance to objects, and they would be able to navigate spaces, and they would describe the experience in very much the same way that we would describe visual experiences, albeit very coarse. So it became a vision of sorts, which also tells you something about the nature of perception, because it's not necessarily that what we call vision needs to go through purely our eyes. It's kind of the way we represent the world, either distally or proximally. And I think that it's a very interesting experiment to also think about this in social terms. So what does this distal versus proximal navigation mechanism also mean in terms of social interaction? So I think it's a very interesting question, a deep one, and I don't have a satisfying answer, but it's certainly something that's worth pondering on.
Before I moved to Utrecht, I lived in Vancouver, and the apartment below, my neighbor, he was blind, and we went to the pub that was below our building quite a few times. And I don't know if, we were walking back, him with his arm around me because he liked me so much because he couldn't see, or that we were both very drunk. But I'll make sure to ask him that question next time I see him.
That's a worthy closing sentence for Pint of Science, right?
For Pint of Science, yes. And I hope. Thanks so much again for agreeing to join us, and we would love to have you back for the next edition, which we can hopefully. Hopefully, I'm sure that we will be able to have that in person again, and then maybe even display some of these technologies. I think there's a very interesting. You're organizing something in about 10 days in Eindhoven. Yeah, that may be interesting to the current audience as well. It's I think the link is below here. It's an event on intimate and sexual robotics. So if people are interested in the part I left out, more or less, because there is an obvious sort of elephant in the room, if you like, which is sexual interaction through technology. And this is part of a special event that we're organizing on the 31st of May with some key speakers. One of them is Kate Devlin, who wrote, I think, the book on sex robotics. Another one is Kathleen Richardson, if I remember correctly, who's very critical about the ethics of using sex robots. So there will be giving presentations. There will be a lively debate. It's going to be online at around the same time that we're doing this. So I think the current audience, can grab a beer as well and join us there. That's awesome. And I think we should do the same now. The terraces will be open. I'd love to discuss some more with you about your science and have a drink. So thanks very much, Wijnand, and thanks everyone who attended via the live streams on YouTube and on Facebook. Tomorrow will be our last Pint of Science event for at least for this. For the current set of events, which I think is Pint of Science Amsterdam again. And then, of course, Pint of Science Eindhoven would love to see you all again for Pint 2022 in person. And with that, I wish you all a very nice evening. And thanks to Wijnand one more time. And
thank you, Roy.
cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Goodbye.